Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson, and joining me from Oklahoma today, y'all, prepare to be humbled. This is going to be a very rich conversation, is Dr. Kathleen McCallie. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm a fan of Lee Larson, and it's an honor to be here today.
Dr. McCallie, I am a fan of you, and we're going to show my audience exactly why I'm a fan. Folks, I know Dr. McCallie through my time at Phillips Theological Seminary when I went through for my master's in theological studies. Dr. McCallie is the Associate Professor of Ministerial Leadership and Ethics and has a PhD in political science and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and member of Spiritual Directors International. I've taken a few classes with Dr. McCallie, and I had the opportunity to uh, get to know you better in on the border of Arizona and Mexico, of all places. Here we are going to seminary in Oklahoma, but we're bonding in a completely different environment for the Border Links immersion trip. Uh, Listeners, if you remember, about a month or so ago, I interviewed actually Border Links and to talk about what was going on, so we could highlight, you know, the ICE DHS narrative versus what they're saying Kaylin is seeing over there. But Dr. McCallie, you have such an impressive resume. Can you talk about your journey? Have you always been a part of religion, theology, or was this something later in life?
Was very fortunate to be raised by parents who taught me to ask questions and think critically. So from the beginning, though I didn't do a lot of growing up in church, I started going to church when I was a teenager, and it was a church where people asked questions and and research and information and science were never at odds with faith for me. I and social justice has always been an important part of my faith. So I grew up in a church that was very active in the community, very concerned about world hunger and global issues, and my journey has consistently deepened that connection. Yeah, so I studied political science partly because I traveled to Central America with mission groups when I was young and learned about some of the international issues that affected poverty and wealth distribution, and I decided I needed to understand that more. And so my PhD in political science is really in ethics of international relations primarily, and especially about how trade policy and international policies affect the lives of people all around the world. That always was consistently a part of my faith journey too. So I learned about Palestine and Israel first through the church. Actually, it was a Jewish teacher who first raised my consciousness about what was going on for Palestinians. And then while I was working on my PhD, I studied that issue, was able to take a seminar with a professor who had been the US diplomat and the uh, representative from the United Nations to for the US and learned more about the Palestinian issues from him. And then my first trip there was in 2014. I went with a group of UCC clergy, all very interested in peacemaking efforts. I because of the experience was so profound, I proposed to the seminary that I take students from the seminary on travel classes to Palestine and Israel, and I was able to do that in 2020 and then again in 2023. So the last time I was there was in January of 2023, just 9 months before the October attacks from Gaza to Israel and then the reciprocal attacks.
Yes. Well, and the history of that region is so complex, so rich. There is, I mean, that Palestine is a sacred place for a lot of people. Can you talk about what you and your groups were doing when you were there?
Yes. one of the things that we did was listen to people from various sides, from various perspectives. And of course, there is a lot of polarization and literally different human rights and legal rights, depending on whether you are an Israeli citizen or a Palestinian. I grew up hearing about the Israeli people, the Israelites. And in the Bible, and in church and even in our liturgy, we talk about Israel as a symbol for the people of God, the people who received the promise of Abraham to inherit this particular role of being God's people. And so it was really important for me to begin to understand and then to teach that all of those ancient texts about the Israelites are claimed by Muslims, Jews, and Christians as our spiritual ancestors. So when we think about, like, at church camp, I remember singing the song. Lee, did you ever sing the song, Father Abraham has many sons? Okay. And so even as a Christian growing up, I was claiming, I was taught, we are sons and daughters of Abraham. So when you think about the claim made by Zionists that that particular land is theirs because of that ancient promise, then it's confusing because a lot of Palestinians are Christians, others are Muslims, and they would claim that too. So the whole argument about who has a right to that land is something that's very complex and very intertwined with religious teachings. What I learned, both in my PhD program as well as talking to people there, is that 1947 and 1948, when the modern state of Israel was created, was a time when especially the United States and the UK funded the takeover of land that had been Palestinian land. So if you think about the way Native Americans were moved off of land and white settlers came in, that's very much like what happened in 47 and 48. So about 1 million people were displaced. And this was the main takeaway from my professor that I studied with, that within 1 year, 80% of the people of Palestine were gone. Many were displaced to other areas, but many were killed. So you have Palestinian refugees in all the countries around what is now called Israel, the nation of Israel. And it's so important to make a distinction between Israeli citizens, especially Zionists, and Jewish people, because there are some people who say that anyone who criticizes the nation of Israel is being anti-Semitic. I am completely committed to defending the Jewish people and the Jewish ethos and religious teachings. But not all Israeli citizens are religious people. Many are atheists, and there's a distinction within the Jewish community worldwide about Zionism. Zionism started out as an attempt to have a safe place for Jewish people where they could be equal citizens and not be discriminated against. A lovely vision. But then a new form of Zionism came into being in the 1970s, and it is very much a goal for a theocratic government, for a government where there's no separation between religion and political power, where people who are Jewish have different rights than other people. So you think about, like, comparing it to Christian nationalism. This is a kind of Zionism is a kind of Jewish nationalism in the nation of modern Israel, and many Jews are against it.
I know that you talk about how the formation of the state of Israel back in the 40s and 50s is crucial to now. It does feel like everyone is having to catch up on a lot of history very quickly.
Yes.
For so many people, they're trying to figure out, where did rapture theology come from? Where did this relationship with Israel, the
Yeah.
state, come from? Like,
Yes.
everything feels like, wait, and it's because there has been this whole fringe movement for decades building towards this. Um, I came across my studies recently that said early we can see early traces of Christian Zionism in Martin Luther and John Calvin when they were trying to formulate themselves against the Catholics and the quote Turks. They said the popes and the Turks was how they worded it. So that would have been Catholics and Muslims. So I'm wondering, but it wasn't like what we're seeing now. It was very much almost like, we know we're not Catholic, we know we're not Muslim, can we be allies with the Jews? Like that, it was a different question, especially when we look at Christian Jewish history up until then. And so you start to see this and then some folks have also said that it took a turn with Danbury in the 1800s, but really, like, it seems like this was all the money, the power of it came from post-Holocaust state of Israel creation. Is that kind of where we can point to, like, concretely in modern history, this? Because again, we're having to catch up, Dr. McCallie.
There's so much to talk about. It is essential that Christians, that all people of faith and all people of good conscience, even if they're not religious, understand that Christianity was guilty of persecuting the Jews. That in many ways, and especially if you go back and look at German history before the Holocaust, that there was this sense of national identity. We're going to make Germany great again. We're Christian, and we blame the Jews for the the German loss in World War One, for instance. And so, not just in Germany, but in lots of places, Christians have persecuted the Jews, and, like, the Jews killed Jesus. The Jews are evil. Uh, this is Susanna Heschel is one of the authors, one of the scholars who I recommend on this, and she's really, really good on this, and her father, Abraham Heschel, of course, also taught about this, but the idea that Christians make themselves look better by putting down the Jews, by saying, "The Jews killed Jesus," and things like that. Now, part of what we have to think about is, what does it mean to be Jewish? Is that a religious identity, a national identity? And even when you go back to scriptures and you read about the nation of Israel, we have to think about, what is a nation? So this this is so important now because, again, of Christian nationalism. And we can ask ourselves, what does it mean to be Christian? How is that connected with being American? And so forth. And it's the same for Jewish people. So there are a lot of Jewish people who identify culturally as Jewish, but aren't necessarily religious. Maybe they never go to synagogue. It's not a religious thing for them, but they're very proud Jews. And so this is a this is an identity conflict and complexity that goes way, way, way back, way before, even before Luther. And the conflict between Muslims and Jews historically is also an interesting history. There are times in different parts of the world, especially in different regions of the Middle East, where there were conflicts between Jews and Muslims, and other times where they lived together peacefully. And I think it's so important for us to go back to history and see that Jews, Christians, and Muslims have lived together peacefully for centuries in many parts of the world. It certainly is possible to do that.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cordoba, that was a major mixed historical diverse space. There's another, it was in Spain, I
I
want to
think you're right.
say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that whole region has some beautiful, rich history that's very encouraging to me. because sometimes we get the idea that these groups can't live together in peace, but I strongly believe that they can. And the region of Palestine is a place where there were Christians, Jews, and Muslims living together. So Elias Shakur has the book Blood Brothers. And I've been very blessed when I've taken students there to meet with Elias Shakur and hear his story. But he was a person who was a little boy. He was growing up in a village where there were Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He's Christian, but his area in Palestine is now part of Israel, and his village is gone, and he is still in Palestine, and so there are still some survivors. Jean Zaru is another one. She's traveled in the United States and written a lot, and she also was a little girl, so there are people that can still tell the story of what it was like.
Well, and Dr. McCallie, for my listeners who maybe did not grow up in the faith to understand these stories and why Jerusalem, why Palestine, why this region is critical. This is a very heavy question, so I'm going to try and keep it light. But can you give maybe like a 1 to 2 sentence reason why the Christians want the place, the Jews want the territory, and the Muslims want the land? Like, why? What is each of their claim?
Yes. If you if when we go back and we read the ancient scriptures that we have, we know that the city that is now Jerusalem was a place where there was an ancient temple, and that it was the heart of the Jewish people's identity and religious practice going back to King Solomon, King David. It's very, very ancient. And that the idea that God's spirit was present in a different way there than anywhere else in the world. Now, there are people, even back then, there were people who talked about that. Like, is that really what God is like? That God is really present in one place more than others, or with one people more than others? So that was a contested claim all along. But because the ancient temple was there, it was, and of course, this is where Jesus and his followers were the last few days before his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection. So all of those things happened at that place where that temple was. The temple was destroyed and rebuilt, a number of times. Then for Muslims, it's a sacred place because it is the place where Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven for his night journey. And that's again, that is so it is a very sacred place, the second most sacred place for Muslims. We know a little bit about the history of the Crusades. Probably all of us have heard of that, the Holy Grail and the Crusades and so forth. So from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, people were fighting over this land. But we have to ask ourselves, in any conflict, how much of it is really religious and how much of it is political or economic? And so the fighting right now, I do believe that the Temple Mount, the hilltop where remnants of the ancient temple and then the beautiful Alaska Mosque has been there, that controlling that religious site is a key part of the conflict. But I don't think it's the only part of the conflict. For instance, like if we ask, why was Jesus killed? People will give different some people will say because God demanded a sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. But other people will say, no, it had more to do with his political conflict with the Roman ruler at the time. Similarly, if we ask about what's going on now, I don't think the United States government is interested in the region for religious purposes. I think the access to oil and and military strategy is why the United States has invested so much money. If you think cumulatively since 1947, the United States has given more than $300 billion to the state of Israel, and 97% of that goes for their military. and that is more than twice as much as has been given to any other country by the US since that time. So why is the United States as a government so interested? Well, because we need oil, we need a foothold in the Middle East. I don't think it has anything to do with religion. So there are just a variety of ways of looking at this.
Religion is a very easy way to sell it to the religious voters that, "Oh, they're going along." I've even, like, seen them start to prime the Nigerian Christian narrative, and, like,
Yes.
our administration doesn't care about Nigerian Christians, that's not their but that's how they're gonna prime it. "Oh, we have to go," and Nigeria's obviously so much oil, in the same vein that you're talking about, so it's I agree, and there's a lot to be said about religious rhetoric and warfare, and,
Yes. So true.
it's so true. But yes, this, has been going on for a very long time, but it does feel like for a lot of Americans right now, it all kind of came together at a point, um, lately. I mean, it just very evidently, there's no denying that there's a relationship between the both states, both governments, and, um people should be concerned. That's a lot of our money
A
that they're
lot
telling us we can't pay our teachers for, we can't protect our lands with, we can't
blows
healthcare,
my
pick a thing.
mind that our budget, the US budget for 2026 has over $1 trillion for military spending. And we might think, well, we have to do that to defend ourselves and to work for peace in the world and all that. But if you think about, well, what nation is close to us in military spending? If you rank what nations spend the most on military spending, the US is number 1. China, Russia, Germany, India, and the UK are the next 6. And you have to add all of what they spend on military to equal what the United States spends. Do we really need to spend that much on military spending? I think part of the question, and this is a question of faith for me, as well as just my patriotism. Do we really believe in liberty and justice for all? Or do we just believe in liberty and justice for us? And who is the us? And that's a lot of what drives the conflict all over the world.
It's a very interesting, yeah. It's a good question, and we're even seeing it. I read a article recently that was asking the same question about Peter Thiel, who's behind Palantir. If you're familiar with the tech world, but Palantir is the AI surveillance that has the contracts both at the border that you and I saw, the cameras. They also
Yes.
have the contracts with the state of Israel. And I was reading about, and this was from a queer author because Peter Thiel is queer. He's a queer Catholic libertarian AI demigod in his head. Like if you watch his interviews, he's not on the same earth we are. Like he's in a
Yeah.
different world. And it's an interesting, and the point they were making was that queer Catholic angle of like, you know, you're just hanging so many of us out to dry. There's so much surveillance, so much. It's just really weird what happens when um, power and status and turning your back and again liberty for me, but not for you. Um, and it's just odd. So anyway, I kind of derailed us in that little bit, but I want to talk about you mentioned our military presence. I don't know if you remember Professor Huckleberry, he's behind me
Oh,
sleeping.
so sweet.
Um, but you talk about our military presence being all over the world as a form of neocolonialism. We also, we talk about too Jesus as a protester, a nonviolent protester of empire. Rome had a huge empire with lots of strongholds. Do you see patterns and similarities between Rome and the United States? I know that the United States, our founding fathers, wanted to be a new Rome. They wanted to be this, republic that modeled. Um, but it does seem that we've gotten very too big, like you said, with this bloated budget. Do you see any similarities between like how the United States has expanded and what we know about Rome?
There's a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who's German, who wrote a book called Perpetual Peace, and he really believed that expansionist nations happened because of the egos of the kings. So he lived back kind of when the nation state was just kind of being created, when most areas were ruled by kings or, whatever kind of emperors or something like that. And he really believed that as the world became more democratic, which he thought it would, because he thought that was the best form of government for the future, that war would end and that there would be perpetual peace because people would not vote for their children to go off into war. Now, people have fought with each other about this since the founding of the United States. There were some of the founders who wanted to be kind of isolationist, who didn't want to be expansionist. Right now we see so much. I grew up thinking that Russia, the Soviet Union, was this evil government that tried to take over other nations. And of course, we see them taking over Ukraine, but we have to look at how Israel is the nation of Israel, the modern nation of Israel is expanding, taking over territory in Lebanon, even in Syria, and certainly they've taken over more and more of Palestine. So the United States is in the role of an expansionist nation right now, and I don't think that's consistent with what all of the founders wanted. I do think, yet there were some who definitely understood it that way. And sadly, we have this terrible history, not only with slavery, but we have this terrible history of expansionism and colonialism yeah, the colonization of Native American lands. And we know that history. But I think we tend not, as Americans, most of us tend not to think of the United States in the same way we think of Russia taking over more and more territory. But for instance, Christians have protested some. Christians, like for instance, Henry David Thoreau went to prison when the United States went to war and took over what's now Texas, the Mexican American War. Thoreau protested that publicly, very verbally, and lots of people protested it. And Thoreau ended up going to jail because he refused to pay his taxes that would be used for that expansionist war. And there's a beautiful scene where Ralph Waldo Emerson went to visit Thoreau in prison and looked at him in jail and said, "What are you doing in there?" And Thoreau said to Emerson, "What are you doing out there?" So the question of how our faith motivates us to resist some things our government does is a really important history. And I do believe that theologians like Marcus Borg, like Rosemary Radford Ruther, and others who say sometimes we need, as people of faith, we need to stand up and criticize our government. And that's a patriotic thing to do and a thing that our faith calls us to do.
Amen. And that's exactly, at least when I read the Gospels, I do get a sense of a protest, of a sense of the disdain or disgust for the status quo. And that it's just hard to argue with. And every time someone's like, you mentioned earlier that Jesus died because God needed a sacrifice. I'm like, it's a lot of storytelling for that. Like,
Yeah, right. And it's really interesting to think about what kind of a God do you believe in if you believe that. I don't believe that. I very much believe that Jesus was a, a brilliant rabbi teacher, uh, an incredible human person, but that it was political and economic critique that got him killed.
Analogies or similarities you're making today is about how what is going on in Gaza, Palestine is akin to colonialism here in the States and Native American genocide.
Yes.
For folks who have ever read any history on that and thought, what would I do? How would I react? This is now you get to how are you reacting to Gaza and Palestine? This is it. This is that moment because unfortunately these playbooks don't change. These strategies they get shared with one another. And you've seen it so much on your travels, how this expansionism affects other countries, not only governance, but their people all the way down, eventually causing issues that create refugees that come into our country. And then we blame those refugees. And it's like a circular pattern. Um, can you talk about just briefly, can you talk about what you're seeing in your experience either with border links or just even in your you said your missionary travels? Are we calling them humanitarian travels? I don't know what to call them anymore.
I don't
Yeah.
call it I don't call it mission. When I
Yeah.
was young, that was the terminology I would use. I think of it as social justice solidarity work now,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
there's a really big difference. So I'm not
Yeah.
interested in trying to convert anybody. Uh, that's not part of my faith that God wants me to do that. But I think when people request aid, like I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua with groups who have requested aid. And so that's a whole other question about economic justice and trying to
Yes.
change policies. But I want to come back to what you were talking about the militarization of the borders, because you and I saw, and we've got some great pictures of you at the highly militarized border between the United States and Mexico in the south part of Arizona, south of Tucson. And that huge wall that costs, oh my gosh, how much money, and the surveillance towers. And that has just gotten reinforced and further militarized with more and more surveillance now, and it's just shocking how much that's changed in the last 10 years, certainly in the last 50 years. So part of what I think is so important to see is that the walls, the defense that they call them security walls, the walls that separate Palestinian people from Israeli people. And by law, the Palestinians cannot leave those areas without, it's not really like a green card, but it's a card. So they can, some leave to go work in, in lawn care, roofing, different kinds of work, some even professional work, but they have to be back in Palestine behind a wall at night at a certain time. So the walls look very similar. And in fact, they're made by some of the same security companies that are Israeli companies. And the surveillance drones and surveillance towers and so forth all across the United States border between US and Mexico, very similar militarization of the borders with checkpoints and so forth. And I think US citizens need to know more about this highly militarized border. And I think the United States is thinking 50, 60 years from now, there's going to be there's going to continue to be migration. And with climate crisis, there's going to be more and more migration of people. And so, again, there's a question of uh, who has the right to travel. U.S. citizens seem to have the right to travel to Mexico, but it's a lot harder to cross when you're coming back the other way from Mexico into the United States. And I think that's just going to increase.
I agree. And it's interesting too with some of our politicians here in Montana. I know this is across the country, but we've got a number of very conservative politicians that when folks have done either drone or satellite imagery on their house, you see a lot of solar power, wind power. You got underground bunkers with renewable or some sort of natural renewable energy, and it's like, oh, so you do support, right, all of these sorts of renewable energy investments for yourself.
Ah,
And then you also, in the same vein, like you're changing your investments or you're having to change things based on climate. So you're acknowledging this thing is real while denying it, publicly. And it's just a fascinating, it's a whole, like you said, while denying, calling us crazy liberals and our climate change hoax or whatever, they're actively making decisions and investing money in things like surveillance or self sufficiency based on this very real data that all of us are talking about. They just don't want, they want to keep profiting off of it until then.
well, I've heard people say, if you wanna know what you really believe in, look at how you spend your money,
Mm.
a and I think sometimes as people, as a pastor myself, I think sometimes people think of their faith maybe in a little box of something they do on Sunday or religious ideas and so forth. But I think Jesus taught, no, it's about what we do with our money. It's about how we relate to nature and the environment. It's about being kind to other people. And it's about that question, do we really believe in liberty and justice for all creation or just for us?
It's, there's a really good, I don't have it down here, or maybe I do, but, oh, Horsley is his last name, but he wrote, Jesus and the Empire back in, like, '80s or '90s, and I need to ask Dr. Warren Carter if he's familiar with his work, but he talks about, he takes a similar angle as Dr. Warren Carter does in Empire and Jesus, but, like, more of a political one. I mean, Dr. Warren Carter is very much scripture text focused, but, Horsley's whole thing was the depoliticization of Jesus, um, really stemming as a result of the Enlightenment and like separating church and state, like these things that are good, like we think are important, like also contributed to people seeing Jesus as separate. Like they were like, we can just like put Jesus in a box on Sunday and like, because Jesus doesn't have anything to do with the state. Those are different. It's it's not like you and I know, but like when it's a, it's just funny that even in our, I say our best self because I don't want to consider the founding fathers our best self, but like even some of our like best well-intentioned ideas are going to have backlash. I'm currently writing a chapter on the secular paradox and how having a secular society is going to inherently cause a risk of pushing marginalized faiths out to the, faiths out to the margins. Now they're going to coalesce and they're going to have uprisings, and that we can almost like expect just like if you were to craft a nation and say this is what I want to do, that would be in the cons risk list. Is like every so often you're going to have to deal with these religious uprisings because that's what happens. And just been really playing with this idea of how the United States is a quote secular government, but it's not. It's like super friendly with the Protestant and now evangelical side of things. And it's hard to explain. It's just it's hard to explain to anyone else because this United States of America is kind of like what you're saying. There's like a weird imperial cult with it, um, that's happening, and without it being official, and it's just. Anyway, I kind of went down a rabbit hole about like almost like geopolitics, but you're talking about your political science background. I bet Dr. McCallie would understand what I'm saying right
Definitely,
now.
definitely. Yeah.
um,
I think it's a mix. There are a lot of wonderful things in in the movement that became the founders, that became the sort of the foundation of the United States. I love Hamilton, the musical, and I think there truly were a lot of very inspired, idealistic people who really believed in liberty and justice for all, who were willing to die for it and stand up to the British monarchy in the founding of the United States. So it's not like they're just bad things. in the founding. But as you said, there are consequences sometimes, and sometimes there are motives that are not good. Yeah. But I also believe the freedom for religious exploration in the United States, and even what some people would call secular. I think there's a lot of spiritual expression and exploration that maybe people wouldn't use religious terminology, but I truly believe that when we really lose ourselves in wonderment, like when we're in nature, that's what Jesus wanted us to do. I don't think Jesus so much cared whether we said, this creed or that creed or this about virgin birth. I don't think Jesus cared about that, but I think he taught connecting with the power, the sacred power in nature, in intimate connection with other people, in music, prayer, that there is a power greater than violence. But I think there are a lot of people who don't believe that, who really believe that violence is the greatest power that might make.
Yes. And, and it just creates so much suffering, and you brought up Nicaragua, and I know we kinda went down a tangent, but going back, that might makes right, but then it makes consequences, and then it
Yeah,
makes refugees. Can you give an example to some of the folks, who like, just if you could you share a little bit about the impact of the United States policy on Nicaragua, and then how it causes damage to the people, and then eventually Nicaraguan refugees that come to the United States and then get brought into the immigration discourse, which of course we all know is very hostile. So if you could kind of talk about that pipeline for those who may not understand how it's all connected.
or it's a great question. Thanks for that. Central America, not just Nicaragua, but El Salvador, Guatemala. I mean, we can talk about South America too. There's so many ways in which the United States had uh, entrepreneurs who were building railroads, who were extracting minerals, gold, timber, uh, who were mining different kinds of precious metals and things all across Central America. And so by the early 1900s, the US Marines were sent in to protect investors. This is very similar to colonists who went west and then got in conflict, and then the US had to send in cavalry to protect people who were settling in land they didn't own. So the same thing happened in Central America. And in Nicaragua, the US Marines pretty much controlled through different puppet dictators the whole country of Nicaragua. However, there was a rebellion by this by different people, but there was a famous guy named Sandino who led a resistance against the United States in Nicaragua in the early 1900s. And he was killed by the US in a really brutal way, and his body was dragged through the streets of towns and all this kind of stuff to show US might. Then in the '60s and '70s, there was a rebellion called the Sandinista Rebellion that was ending they were named claiming the history of Sandino, so it's all this history of people trying to resist US control, and they won their revolution in the '70s and tried to have a nation that is not just controlled by US companies and US military. Like in a lot of these places, it's very much like a plantation type society where just a very small percent of people own the land, and most people are peasants and work just barely have enough money for enough food to eat day by day. I mean, we're talking extreme poverty. And there are different times when those people absolutely, literally travel to the United States on foot because the government in their area is repressing people and disappearing people. And so as people have stood up to the United States intervention, the US has funded the dictators that are trying to keep everything in the hands of a few wealthy people. And the wealthy people can lobby in the United States, and then the United States sends foreign aid to their armies. And so I've known many people and I've met many people, and I think you and I met some people when we were in Tucson who had walked from South America, Central America, months of traveling because literally their family was dying because they didn't have enough food to eat. So migration happens for economic reasons, not be sometimes that, yes, there's that American dream, but people don't just up and move for no reason. I think about, the migration of Irish immigrants that was part of my history during the famine years in Ireland. People didn't want to leave their homeland. But oftentimes a million people starved in Ireland within a couple of years during the famine. And the only way some people survived was to get on a boat and go somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I mean, we think about I had a colonel, a special ops colonel who his focus, he was on the podcast recently, and his whole focus was Iran and Hezbollah. And he was making a lot of the same arguments you made about how all of our conflict with Iran goes back into the 1950s as well. And it talks about how, like, we did a lot of, he goes into detail about how we made Kingmaker, we played Kingmaker over there. And oh, so much of the mess, the conflict really is United States founded in some way, right? And it's a really even he was talking about the creation of the Taliban, like we armed them back in the 70s with the Soviet during the Soviet conflict, and just like again, there is I don't I it there is just that's what happens when you're so big. You are both the evil and the good. I mean, it's really hard to wrap it because I've done a lot of travel on behalf of America, in a good way, like in a human. I'm here to help, and I really want to be in this thing that um I don't want to like say like savior and some like white savior privilege. Like I mean, just in that heartfelt, like I just want to be called to do good, and that's what I thought America. I think that's what a lot of people think America was. That like, yeah, we're here, we're defenders of democracy and freedom, and that narrative is really hard to maintain when you start looking into it. Very hard.
Yes, and part of it is it's when we talk about what America does, it's important not to just lump in individuals who are getting super, super rich off the military industrial complex. And sometimes those individuals, business people, are lobbying the government, and sometimes it's hard to sort out what's government and what's lobbyists. But sadly, again, I believe in the idealism of America, but it's just like right now there's a lot of discussion in Israel about sort of far right, greater Israel, expansionist Israel, and there are people in Israel fighting over, well, that's not consistent with our values. Some people say it is. Same probably everywhere in the world, but certainly in the United States.
We just had someone win the Democratic primary in Montana. He was a corporate firearm manufacturer, hunting gun type person, uh, who left his corporate firearm job because the corporation kept funding candidates who were taking away the public lands that he was using his guns to go hunt on. And he was like,
Yes.
hold on, like, I just wanted other guys to go hunt if they wanted to and to have the right like, we are now talking about different things, and that's what called him to run. He was like, "I love public lands. I'm a
Yeah.
conservation hunter person." And it was such an interesting conversation to see just where people draw their line at certain ways. He also, I've known some folks too that Um, just like I said, all of this is people are catching up on a lot of history. They're seeing how consequences like we don't as citizens, we don't get to live purely and ethically when a system is structured the way it is. And it's been really fascinating to see so many people start asking questions and trying to figure out. And a big thing too that I know that you are very good about is as people are asking all these questions and digging for truth and trying to learn is it can be very dark. Can we talk about joy? Can we talk about sustainability for the long term? Because you've been doing this for a while. How do you do it? And how can we learn from you? How does we we're in it for the long haul.
Oh, I think that I love Alice Walker's writing. I think she's a great prophet of our times. Her book, Possessing the Secret of Joy, is one of my favorite books. And her part of what she says is that being in the struggle, resistance is joyful. And when I think about what gives me the most joy and what I want to do in this complex, bruised, weary, messy world, being with people like you, with others who are working for the common good, working for a more compassionate and sustainable world, working for the environment and so forth. That's joyful. I get great, great joy from that. I was talking earlier about connections with nature. And Jesus talked a lot about when he's talked about consider the lilies of the field. I think he might have been saying contemplate them, and I find that just being out and really contemplating and being one with birds and in whether it's hiking, whether it's swimming, whether it's whatever it is, be putting the screen down, spending time in nature, the stars. Those are some of the ways that I get recharged and refilled. Intimacy with other people, and I honestly think, though we have this Puritan Christian tradition, and I think even things like sexual intimacy and pleasure, but love, but also different kinds of intimacy, like being with a friend or another person and really having a soul connection for the moments. Those, I think, are ways that our spiritual batteries get recharged. And I think those are forms of prayer. I love the movement of groups singing. I have a friend in Seattle, and she says there are a lot of times when people get together and sing, but it's not churchy songs. It's not even in church. It's just community getting together and singing songs together. I think music really can realign our brain synapses. So those are some of the things that I find, which is not to say that I don't have times of deep, dark despair. Those are some of the ways that and studying history, because people have endured and protested and changed so many things in history, and that gives me a lot of inspiration.
And one of the things you talked about was, being in nature, reconnecting, that as a form of gratitude. That's a very Thoreau inspired suggestion, by the
Yes,
way, speaking
yes.
of, but it's so true. And what I love about being out in nature is like, i- is the interconnectedness of it, B, the peace, and to like, especially looking at things that are old, like just whether it's mountains, forests, beaches, like those things have seen so much time. And I think about that a lot. Like when I went to the Grand Canyon, that was one of my takeaways. I was like, this canyon has seen so many things come and go.
Yes.
Like, and I recently came across some fact about there are to this day certain sharks that are swimming in the North Arctic that are prehistoric, that predate um, cave drawings, and I just think that is so powerful that there are animal that there's life on Earth that has existed before we even attempted to describe what God was,
Yes,
and
yeah.
that
Trees,
is
trees, ancient trees. I
right.
and I experience a kind of mystery that I can't explain, and I think that that's where my faith, my spirituality is nourished, that there are powers that are greater than what I can understand.
Stories too. I had the opportunity to go and camp in the Black Hills of the Dakotas,
Oh,
and for those who aren't familiar, I know that people don't think about the Dakotas that often, but I promise you, there is a whole forest ecosystem at they're called the Black Hills because the forestry is so dense that it's dark. Like, that is how thick the forests are. So it's not black grass on hills. It's just such dense coverage, and you can feel I came back and I said, I the old gods have been there. I don't know how to describe it. And someone was like, gods? And I was like, I don't. But of
yeah,
course, like a lot of my indigenous peers were like, no, she's like, you feel it. There's just some things that there's, it's just cool. And
yeah,
I
same.
encourage folks to be open and to continue finding theologies that support that, like
Yes,
support creation, life giving, liberation, love. Because we have, man, in all of our fear and all of our upheaval, we're really reacting with a lot of. I was even watching a video today that was like, if you wear this, you're MAGA, or if you do this, you're a left. You wear that, and I was like, I get it. I get appearance is a marker of safety for folks, but also like we're starting to lose the plot, guys. Like, um, like, um, so I'm just so thankful for you coming on today. I we didn't even there is we any one of these questions we could have made a whole podcast about, right? So I do hope that you'll come back. I would love to sink deeper into Gaza and Palestine, but also um, even touching on love, on romance, on relationship as a form of spirituality is a beautiful deep dive I'd really like to cover with you. But until then, can you tell folks how they can learn more about you or learn more about your causes?
I'm especially happy to share, about a book that I wrote called Spirituality Beyond Borders that is about Nicaragua and many of the things that I learned from people there and continue to learn from people there. I'm doing some research right now on female images of the divine. That's something that I've studied a lot and worked with in, for instance, Rosemary Redford with her tradition. I was very blessed to study with her and to study way feminist theology and how I really believe that more harmony with nature and openness to different ways of thinking both about Christianity, but about other religions can be opened up when we think about women's roles and queerness and uh, different relationships between gender, pleasure, and spirituality. So I'm working on that. I do want to highly recommend a website called Breaking the Silence that is previous people who were Israeli soldiers who are now telling their stories about the human rights violations against Palestinians. It's a website that's I think it's hosted in Germany, but Breaking the Silence, it's really worth looking at if you wanna learn more about that. So, highly recommend that.
There's just I I love the books that you assigned us to, and funny enough, I'm thinking about as you're talking about books and causes. I had a Catholic worker. Are you familiar with the Catholic worker movement?
Sure.
I
Dorothy
had a
Day.
I had a Catholic worker, uh, communist John Brown lover is how their
Yes.
bio online describes
Nice,
him.
nice.
And
I
I was
love
like, "Come
it.
on the podcast," but, that'd be super fun to get both of you in the room too, and, um, folks, I briefly talked about how I got to go to Harper's Ferry last year, and that was because of Dr. McCallie talking about John Brown and just seeing different ways of advocacy, protest. Again, we have nonviolence and pacifism, and then we have someone like John Brown, and there's just a spectrum of, of strategies and talking academically and respectfully about all of them. I think is really important for all of us as we try to figure out like, so what do I do and where do I fall? And it turns out there's a lot of space for folks in a revolution.
Yeah. Oh, well, get that down. That's an important line there. There's a lot of space for people in a revolution. I love that line, Lee.
Turns out when you get to the
And
place of
and we
revolution,
need and revolution needs a lot of different angles, people working from different angles for change. Have you seen the new musical Suffs?
no, oh my
Oh,
gosh.
you've gotta see it. It's about the suffragists, and it shows that the ability of people working from different angles to bring about change is beautiful.
Someone was telling me um, that they were inspired. It was actually someone from Phillips, Ruth, but was telling me how they're inspired by Rachel Held Evans as
Yeah,
like the gateway to the. They were like, that's what like, talking about. Like, we need more Rachel Held Evans at the pipeline
yeah,
gateway. Oh, sorry,
yes,
just to like get more people in because of just. And I thought that was a really cool way to describe it
I
too. Like,
like
even
that.
if you aren't comfortable being a voice of that side of it, like, there's room on the fringes of just, like, getting people over, and I
So
just
true. And
there's a
also
lot of
people
different
don't
ways.
even claim necessarily to be doing something religious, like, I mentioned Alice Walker earlier, and I really think her books are truly prophetic, though she doesn't name herself as a theologian necessarily, but I would name her as a theologian.
This has been absolutely fantastic. Again, folks, don't forget to check out Dr. McCallie's work. Um, that is uh, thank you for writing books like that. Again, that is Spirituality Beyond Borders, and that's gonna be, focused a lot on Dr. McCallie's work down in Nicaragua, and, looking forward to more conversations about that. Do you have any parting words before we wrap up?
Only thank you. It inspires me that people like you are doing this work.
It's truly healing, like, having these conversations and then realizing, like, "Okay, yes, there's so many people. I'm not crazy. I'm not alone."
Right.
Like, we're there's movement here, and, so thank you for your work, for educating. I mean, you think about all the number of theologians and pastors and chaplains that you have empowered over the years, the gift. That's the cool thing about education is the number of lives is exponential for what you've done. So that's, I mean, directly, like I have a podcast of 250,000 followers directly because of the education you've given me. So thank you, really. Um, and folks, this has been another episode of Follow the Leader. If you have any questions or, particularly if Dr. McCallie comes back a second time, drop those in the comments so I'll be sure to ask those questions, comments, anything like that. Or maybe you have something that you wanted us to cover deeply. We'll make note of that. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. You all know the drill. This has been another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson. And until next time, see ya.